Island Hop and World War II Stop. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is April 7th, 2021. And on this date in history in 1974, Hank Aaron set the all-time home run record. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this lesson. We have a lot to do today, so everyone hold on. So, Japan held large parts of Asia and large parts of the Pacific, and had captured or massively assaulted several U.S. bases all the way back to Hawaii. They created strongholds in many of these islands that would have been, fought to the last. People so dedicated that in 1974, 29 years after the war was over, a man by the name of Onoda was still manning his post because he never received official word from the Japanese government that the war was over. So to try and avoid some of these positions, the United States started a policy of island hopping, or moving around some of the more fortified islands to starve out the opposition and to take Japan. So rather than fighting a bloody battle on every island, moving closer and closer to Japan, they could move around some of them and save lives. As we got closer, this does allow us to make attacks actually on Japan proper itself. And there we launch a firebombing of Tokyo. The majority of the homes in Tokyo were made out of wood, and so our bombers dropped bombs filled with napalm, a jellied gasoline that explodes on contact, and these bombs incinerated the cities because napalm you can't put out. You spray it with water, and the fire spreads. You spray it with fire, and the fire spreads also, but generally people don't spray fires with fire. I know they say fight fire with fire, but that's not what that means. There were about 25,000 people, or 25,000 buildings that were destroyed, and over 83,000 people were killed in this firebombing. So, Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was one of a couple of islands that the United States needed to capture to get close enough to Japan to really go on extended bombing raids of Japan. And so the Marines landed on the island. They got there, they couldn't find any evidence of anyone being there. So they started to set up camp. In the middle of the night, they found out what the Japanese had been doing for the last 18 months, because surprise attacks come from everywhere. The Japanese had been building tunnels throughout the island, and were springing up through little holes everywhere, attacking U.S. troops, then disappearing and popping up out of other ones to the point where it created chaos on the island. About 4,000 troops will lose their lives before Iwo Jima was captured. Okinawa was a tragedy for far more reasons. Okinawa was a completely different story. The troops fought a very long, hard fight in capturing the island, and 50,000 U.S. troops were lost. Of the 350,000 Japanese civilians, about 150,000 of them committed suicide so as not to be captured by the Americans on that island. So the Soviets were making their push back into Germany, and as they're fighting their way through, they go back through Poland, which is kind of where everything began for the Soviet Union. And as they're going in to fight the Nazis, the Nazis the Nazis, as they're retreating, they were allowed to retreat if they destroyed the Polish army on their way out. The pursuit slowed in Poland just to further destroy Poland and the Polish ability to defend themselves. So the Battle of the Bulge. This was Germany's last attempt to stop the Allies. This was a battle that took place over 6 weeks. And what happened is the Germans were moving in. U.S. forces came in and pushed through the middle, but the Germans secured their lines and cut the U.S. forces in half for 6 weeks. So for 6 weeks, half of the U.S. forces were behind enemy lines. It was ferocious fighting in the middle of a very cold winter. Many people died due to the elements. But once the U.S. won this battle, there was little to stop the Allies from pushing into Germany from the west. On the east side, the Soviets had already pushed into Germany, and then it was a race towards the capital. Now, in addition to wanting to win the war, both sides wanted to get their hands on the German engineers and scientists. Some of them had created an innovation of airplane jets, which were faster and more maneuverable than the planes that we were using. And many of these scientists were used to create the foundations of the Soviet space program and NASA in the United States. People don't often brag about it, but it is something that did happen. So Adolf Hitler knew that the end was coming. He celebrated his birthday. For those of you who don't know, he was born on April the 20th, 1889. If he were alive today, he would be almost 132. So he's most definitely dead. For anyone who's a conspiracy theorist who said he survived that, yeah, he's not kicking anymore. So anyway, he celebrates his birthday on April 20th, and during that time, he turns to Ava and he says, "Ava, you've been a wonderful, wonderful partner. I'm sorry we never got married. I love you, but I want you to go off to Austria and I want you to have a good life, okay? Go out, have a good life, and live well." And she turns and she says, "Addie." She called him Addie, A-D-D-Y. It was, I guess, a term of affection, and she said, "I could never leave you," and he was so happy, and so they went to the bunker. So then, over the next 10 days, even though he has no forces, he's moving around imaginary forces that were already dead to defend the city, and things are going really poorly. He actually made a lot of jokes when FDR died, made jokes about the cripple being dead, but life was not going to be long for him. So April the 30th came along. This was a day that he woke up that day, went out, got a breath of fresh air, went and checked on his dog Blondie, who had just had puppies. And he decided, "I'm going to die today." So he went in and told Ava, "Let's get married and then kill ourselves." And she was so excited. She'd been looking forward to her wedding date forever. And now it was coming. So Hitler took his advisor, Joseph Goebbels, and said, "I'm going to kill myself today, but I'd like for you to take over." And Joseph broke down in tears and said, "Please don't do this, please don't do this." But, once Hitler had his mind made up on something, it was hard to change it. So he put into plans, he was going to take some cyanide and then shoot himself in the head. So they have the ceremony. You're a beautiful Aryan. Do you take this woman to be your Aryan bride so that you can have Aryan lives to Aryan together, and Aryan, 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 Aryan. And so they had the ceremony. They're married. Everyone shakes their hands. They're really excited. And Hitler goes off because, he does not know if cyanide works. So what does he do? Let's test it on Blondie, his dog that had just had puppies that day. So he tested on Blondie and the puppies because, you really don't want your dog to live in a world without Hitler. So he gave cyanide to his dog and to the puppies and watched them all die and was like, "Man, that really sucks, but I want to make sure I'm dead." So he and Ava go off into a room together, and They're sitting there, they're talking because it's their wedding day. It's a special day. And Joseph Goebbels breaks in and begs one last time, Adolf, please don't kill yourself. My kids, they don't need to lose their favorite uncle. All of his kids called him Uncle Addy. And so Hitler's like, no, it's going to happen. So he kicks him out of the room. So Hitler and Eva both take the cyanide, and as the cyanide's working, he shoots himself in the head. You hear the gunshot in the hall. Joseph Goebbels and his wife are beside themselves with agony and overwhelming depression and sadness. So Joseph tells his wife, you know what we need to do. So she goes to their children and says, we're going on a big trip tomorrow. They had 8 children. And she said, to go on this trip, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of chocolate and we're going to go to bed early tonight. So she gave all 8 of her children chocolate laced with cyanide, killing all 8 of their children. Then, again, before the day ended on April 30th, Joseph and his wife go for a walk in the courtyard. The last time it's not overrun by Allied forces. And they turn to each other and he shoots her in the head and shoots himself in the head. And that's the end of both of them. So, after Hitler's dead and his first successor, Joseph Goebbels, died of mysterious suicidal circumstances, they put Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz in charge of the Third Reich. He's only in charge for 10 days, and he desperately wants to surrender to the Allies. But he doesn't really have that opportunity because the Soviets are right there. So he ends up surrendering, unconditional surrender, on May 7th, 1945, and VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, is on May 8th, 1945. Karl Dönitz, because he is in charge of the country at the end, he will spend 10 years in a prisoner of war camp. Or not in a prisoner of war camp, in a camp as at the Nuremberg trial. So at the Potsdam Conference, okay, Potsdam is this beautiful little town right outside of Berlin. My wife and I stayed there about 10 years ago. It's quite beautiful. Anyway, so there, Harry Truman, the new president of the United States, Joseph Stalin, and the new British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, they get together and they agree to several things at the end of the war. Okay, so it's 2 months after Hitler has killed himself. So they want to hold war crimes trials for all the Nazis that had anything to do with the Holocaust or the war. Stalin wanted heavy reparations from Germany, which is one of the things that led to World War II in the first place. Truman told him no, and then told him about the atomic bomb. Imagine that you said, hey, Mr. Dugdale, can I turn in this paper late? And I say no, and I have a gun. This is what you call a threat. And this is what we provided to the Soviet Union. And believe it or not, relationships between the U.S. and the Soviet Union started to sour after this moment in U.S. history. So the Manhattan Project, this is started under General Groves. He is the military leader in charge of the base. And Robert Oppenheimer is the lead scientist. In the creation of the atomic bomb, which is worked on in New Mexico, they employed 130,000 people and were able to keep this a secret. It also cost over $2 billion to make. After working on this for a couple of years, they were finally able to create the bomb. And when they were about to test it, about half the scientists thought that the chain reaction could be something that couldn't be contained and it could destroy the universe. But they didn't talk about it any longer than that, and they ended up setting it off. And luckily for them, it did not kill everyone on Earth or the universe. Okay? So they set it off. They only had 3 bombs, though, and this could be a problem. So, anyway, here we go.
Hiroshima. The fateful day was August 6, 1945. Paul Tibbets, the man in charge of the mission and flying the plane was named Enola Gay. That was his mother's name. They dropped Little Boy and it went off 2,000 feet over Hiroshima. The explosion was as powerful as 13 kilotons of dynamite. 70,000 people died in the instant blast that happened, and another 295,325 people died afterwards. Now, on the top left-hand side, you can see what's left of the city after the bomb. You can see the bomb blast on the right-hand side, but what they did is they took aerial pictures before and after. The middle one shows what the city looked like just a few hours beforehand, and the one underneath it showed what was left afterwards. A complete and total devastation. So the Japanese were given warnings a few days in advance this was going to happen. They let the bomb hit, and so for the next day and a half, they're trying to get word from the Japanese. Is this going to be over, or do we have to drop one of these every 3 days until there's nothing left of Japan? They didn't answer, so once again, the U.S. will be prepared to drop another atomic bomb. Nagasaki was one of the largest seaports in the in Japan. One of the largest seaports and one of the largest industrial centers. They made a lot of weapons and supplies there. Major Sweeney is going to drop Fat Man, which is the bigger of the two bombs, but it doesn't kill as many people. Still ferocious and horrible. 40,000 people die instantly. Another 165,409 people will die in the immediate aftermath. If you look up in the top left-hand side, you can see kind of the same image that you see in the picture right below and see where ground zero is, and it destroys everything in that area. Even though this was a bigger bomb, what actually helped prevent more devastation was the fact that it was up in the mountains. Japan was given more time at this point before we threatened to drop another atomic bomb, which we did not have. It would be months before we had another atomic bomb, and then we had enough to drop one every 3 days for about 100 days by the end of 1945. Victory in Japan was on August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. The only condition that they wanted in their surrender was that the emperor would not be tried or arrested for war crimes. Other than that, the war was over, and they officially signed the documents on the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, ending the war. The Asian New Order. Okay. Once Japan is pushed out, there's a real desire to put Asian countries under Asian leadership. Okay. So conquered Southeast Asia was under Asia for Asians. This promises new governments in places like Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Vietnam, and the Philippines. But each country was under Japanese control. And so this is an effort done afterwards to try and take control back of the countries. Now, the truth is European nations, once they recover from World War II, will reassert themselves over most of these countries. But there is a push within these countries to have them rule their own country. Now, in most of the Nazi countries, you had certain collaborators that once the Nazis rolled in would help them do all the things that they wanted to do. Whether this was the extermination of the Jews, which there were always large pockets of population in countries like Czechoslovakia at the time, Hungary, several of these European nations where they go in and people are willing to go and raid all the Jews' homes. And so they did this because if you helped out the Nazi governments, they would let you keep the spoils of what you had. So if you killed off a family, you got to take all their wealth and all their riches. Okay, so when the war is over, there's revenge that's taken on all of these people that were doing this. In France, what they did to all the women who were keeping the Nazi soldiers warm at night, they shaved all of their heads publicly and let everyone know that they had collaborated and slept with the Nazis. And many of them were outcast for the rest of their lives. Okay, in Norway, Vadkun Kiesling, he really becomes a synonym for these type of people that will collaborate with the enemy and help the invaders when they come in. These are political opportunists that want to keep their position and don't really care about the people so much as they care about their power and their status. Okay, in the Balkans, Ustaše was a Croatian Catholic nationalist, and he went right after the Orthodox Serbs whenever he was in a similar position of power. And by the way, this is going to be one of several different hate crimes that will take place and genocides that will take place over the next 50 years in the Balkans. So all of the area just north of where Greece is today has been under constant revolution throughout the centuries. Now, there were resistance movements. The most famous of the resistance movements in Europe at the time was done by the French. This is under Charles de Gaulle. They would meet in the sewers, hide things in the sewers, build special safe rooms underground to protect art and other objects away from the Germans that were moving in. Now, some of these were just common thieves who were trying to steal things for themselves and keep them after the war and make money that way, but several were actually fighting against the Germans, and they would help Americans that were caught behind enemy lines in the early months of following D-Day, and this is one of the ways that the French did help the invading English and Americans. Now, in Yugoslavia, you have a different type of deal going on there. And they will actually become a communist nation. Okay? So Joseph Tito, the guy who will eventually become the premier or leader of Yugoslavia, he fought against the Nazis with about 250,000 troops, and 100,000 of them were women. And this is the only country in Eastern Europe that did not need Nazi help, or did not need Soviet help to get rid of the Nazis. They were able to push them out themselves, and after the war, Tito stays in power and will become an ally of the Soviet Union without having them take control of his nation. They kind of use him as the example of people that actually wanted to be communist. In Poland, a guy by the name of Zagoda saves hundreds of Jews by hiding them out, changing their names, giving them false papers. 600,000 Jews will be killed in Poland during the Holocaust, but he was able to save several hundreds of them. Denmark, on the other hand, even though it was really under the control of the Germans, they were able to rescue almost all 8,000 of the Jews that were in their population. Now, in Great Britain during the war, women on the home front were made a large part of the war effort. And this is kind of a continuation of World War I and what women did for the war then, but they continued to do that in World War II as well. And not only that, some of the older citizens and older veterans and policemen were part of the Home Guard, so that if there's any type of invasion, it was their job to try and help protect the home front. They also created what were called victory gardens to get people to grow more food, so that more of the food that was grown by the farmers could be used to help the soldiers on the war front. They were also there to make more fuel and ration what they had. And most of the rationing that was done until 1951. And so you were only allowed so many meats a day, and really everything you did was controlled by the government for such a long time, just in the rebuilding and recovery from World War II also. 55% of the people in Great Britain were part of the military work or the civilian war work at home. The U.S. home front, another place where women were vital to the war production to make the country successful in the war. They produced more tanks, planes, and ships than the rest of the nations combined. But they never fully went into wartime production. Food was rationed once again, just like in Great Britain, to the point where you did not. You grew your own food as well. We had victory gardens in the United States, but fuel was not rationed. There were no problems with shortages of food. Japanese Americans were put into internment camps in the United States as well. Most of their stuff was sold off for nothing. They had no money, nothing to show for anything they did, and they sat in those prisoner of war camps for 2 to 3 years after the war was over. Germany also did whatever they could to help with the war, but they never mobilized the women for the war until the war was in its last month or two. They didn't try and ration any type of consumer goods for the civilian population. Had they done that, they might have been able to hold a little bit later, or hold on a little bit longer in the war. They used slave labor for armament productions, and this is going to cause a lot of the misfiring and problems that they're going to have fighting the war in the end. They also used occupied territory to make their weapons as well. That's where they made them. The land didn't actually produce weapons, other than storms. But you couldn't really control that, sadly. Albert Speer was eventually appointed the Minister of Armaments in 1944, and he will go to jail for about 10 years. He was kind of the architect of the cities that Hitler wanted to build, the future of the world. He was the architect for that. There is some question whether or not he was actually part of that and embraced it, or just did that because it was his job, and he claimed that was his job. In the Soviet Union on the home front, about 20 million Soviet civilians would die during World War II. And despite the fact that Stalin was such a totalitarian dictator, he really becomes a hero after this because he does stay to fight and defend the country. But then he after the war, he's going to promote the super centralization of the economy, where the government will control every single part of what's being produced and what's being sold. Leningrad, which isn't talked about as much as Stalingrad, had a 900-day siege. So for 2.5 years, the Germans were trying to push through to the city. They cut off all supplies to everything, and the people that survived lived off of dogs, cats, mice, birds, and a few of them were forced to go to cannibalism to survive the war. The Japanese home front, okay? Part of being Japanese was trying to make a better world for the future, even though you might not be able to see that. And the biggest goal of anyone who's trying to create a protege is that their protege surpasses what they're able to do. So people follow these traditional themes of obedience and sacrifice. And they served under this samurai code called Bushido. Okay? The way of the warrior. Kamikaze pilots would actually volunteer to serve in these mass suicide missions against U.S. warships, where they would crash their planes into the warships to hopefully sink the ship. Eventually, you would also see kamikaze soldiers that would surrender, and they would go to American soldiers and blow themselves up as they were being captured to try and take out as many American soldiers as possible. Now, the Greater Japanese Women's Association, this is a push by the government to get women to have more children. Because much like the Germans and the Italians, and even the Russians, the Soviets, there was a lot of emphasis on growing the nation, growing the people through childbirth. And particularly in countries like Italy and Germany and Japan, where they believed that they were the master race, the idea was to create more of the master race to make the world a better place. So have more children. This is a Greater Japanese Women's Association. Women did work in textile and farming, but they were not part of the production of arms as they were in the United States and in Great Britain. Of the major powers, the U.S. really had the fewest casualties. For the British, they had a lot of civilian dead, which added to their number, and so did the Italians. The war cost $330 billion more than all the other wars fought in U.S. history combined. And the national debt's going to quintuple as a result of the war. But it does end this fight. Okay? And it also ends this unit. So I hope everyone made it through. We have 2 major wars to talk about and a lot of depression. So this brings us to the end of today. I hope everyone had a great day today. This is the end of this unit, so make sure you're ready for the test. So don't cocaine, don't AIDS, and I will see you on the other side, everyone. Stay safe, but don't be a safe. So have a good one.